Nobody expected the judge to be the one leaving in handcuffs. For 15 years, Judge Jessica Black ran her courtroom like a kingdom. Ruthless, revered, and always in control, she mocked lawyers, silenced witnesses, and built a reputation for taking no prisoners. But on one rainy Tuesday morning in downtown Manhattan, everything changed. Pam Bondi, the former Florida Attorney General, was appointed to prosecute a high-profile corruption case involving Brighton Development Corporation, a case the media believed would end her career. Judge Black certainly thought so. She didn't just rule from the bench, she performed. And on this day, she made a mockery of Bondi in front of a packed courtroom. Laughter echoed. Reporters typed gleefully. Bondi appeared defeated. But beneath that calm exterior, Bondi was laying a trap. 3 hours later, the laughter had stopped. The gavel lay cracked. And Judge Black? She was the one in cuffs, escorted from her own courtroom by federal agents. This is how it happened. The federal district court in Lower Manhattan buzzed with anticipation. The Brighton development case had captured national headlines: billions in fraud, environmental crimes, alleged bribery of foreign officials. It was the kind of scandal made for television, and it had the cast to match. At the center of the storm stood Judge Jessica Black, 52 years old, sharp-witted, fiercely progressive. Appointed under a Democratic administration, she was known for her incisive legal mind and unforgiving demeanor. Lawyers dreaded her interruptions. Reporters lived for them. She entered the courtroom at 9 a.m., sharp, black robes trailing behind her like a curtain closing on a play. Every step was a performance, every glance a verdict. When she sat, the room fell silent. Across the courtroom sat Pam Bondi, blonde, poised, and dressed in a navy suit that stood out against the sea of gray legal uniforms. She quietly reviewed her notes. As a special prosecutor for the Department of Justice, Bondi was tasked with unraveling a corporate behemoth's tangled web of shell companies and shadow accounts. Her appointment was controversial. Liberal commentators questioned her credentials. Conservative pundits framed her as a martyr. Bondi, however, seemed unaffected. She was calm, composed, almost too quiet. The gallery was packed. Reporters elbowed for position. Law students craned their necks. Camera lenses pointed like rifles toward the front of the courtroom. Judge Black leaned forward and struck the gavel. The United States versus Brighton Development Corporation is now in session. Prosecution. You may proceed. Bondi rose. Thank you, Your Honor. The sound of her voice, even and professional, marked the official start of the battle. But the real fight had begun long before anyone entered the courtroom. Everyone expected Bondi to fail, and Judge Black was ready to help make sure of it. Pam Bondi began her opening statement with calm, calculated control. Your Honor, the government will demonstrate that Brighton Development Corporation engaged in a sustained pattern of fraudulent accounting, offshore laundering, and regulatory evasion. She barely made it 2 minutes in before Judge Black cut her off. Miss Bondi, the judge said, removing her glasses with exaggerated flair, please tell me we aren't starting with a lecture in Accounting 101. This is federal court. We've all passed the bar. Laughter flickered through the gallery. A CNN correspondent jotted down a quote. Bondi didn't flinch. If I may continue, she said. You may, the judge replied, waving a hand. But let's keep the storytelling to a minimum, shall we? Bondi pressed on, laying out the mechanics of Brighton's financial structure. But with every few sentences, Judge Black pounced. That's redundant, counselor. Spare us the dramatics. Are you testifying now? The defense team sat relaxed, arms crossed, barely bothering to object. They didn't have to. The judge was doing their job for them. One of the younger attorneys whispered, she's skinning her alive. Pam Bondi, however, remained unshaken. She took every barb without blinking, and slowly, almost imperceptibly, she began to adjust. Her language tightened, her statements shortened. She started preempting the judge's interruptions. What had started as a public flogging was turning into a strategic recalibration, but the courtroom didn't see it yet. All they saw was Judge Black, the titan, dominating the morning, until Bondi said, Your Honor, before we proceed with the first witness, I'd like to address a procedural matter regarding the admissibility of certain documents. Judge Black sighed. If this is another detour, it's a motion under Kellerman v. United States, Bondi said evenly, holding up a thick casebook. Judge Black paused. Her gaze narrowed. Kellerman? Yes, Your Honor. The 1987 decision concerning evidence obtained during unsupervised regulatory inspections. I believe it directly applies to the SEC's conduct with Brighton's Singapore subsidiary. The room stilled. A few legal scholars in the gallery looked up. One began typing furiously. Judge Black tilted her head. Interesting choice. Thank you, Your Honor. I'd also like to cite Hamilton Trust versus Commissioner 2002 and Westmoreland International 2018. And just like that, the tone shifted. Judge Black's condescension faltered for the first time. She waved Bondi forward, and Bondi approached with 2 printed casebooks and a sealed packet of evidence. Page 347, paragraph 3, Bondi noted, placing one of the volumes on the bench. Judge Thornton's concurrence specifically addresses extraterritorial jurisdiction on multinational shell structures. There was a pause, a long one. Black flipped through the pages. A law clerk leaned in and whispered. Bondi waited silently. You're suggesting the court overstepped its admissibility standard, Black finally said. I'm suggesting we define the standard before proceeding further. There was no sarcasm, no raised voice, just a razor-sharp blade of legal precision sliding under the judge's defenses. From the press row, a legal correspondent murmured, "She came loaded." A few seats away, a federal agent shifted slightly, his eyes locked on Judge Black. Bondi turned back to the table, calm, focused, still methodical, and then came the real bomb. "Your Honor," she said, "we also request the court's consideration of potential ex parte communications between the bench and the defense." Dead silence. The judge blinked. "Excuse me?" Bondi held up another envelope. "We've obtained communication records, emails, dated within the last 18 months. We believe they indicate improper discussions between this court and Brighton executives regarding the handling of this case." Chaos exploded. The defense shouted objections. Reporters scrambled. The judge's gavel cracked down. "Miss Bondi, you are skating dangerously close to contempt. Then I respectfully move for the chief judge to review the evidence and determine whether your continued oversight of this trial is appropriate." For the first time, Judge Black looked genuinely rattled. Bondi stood silent. The room had flipped. In less than an hour, the woman they laughed at had just dropped a legal grenade in the courtroom, and the clock was ticking. The gavel had barely stopped echoing when the double doors at the back of the courtroom opened. Chief Judge Robert Montgomery entered, flanked by 2 federal marshals. The entire room stood. Judge Black froze mid-sentence, her jaw tightening as the chief judge strode to the bench. "Due to the allegations raised," he announced, "this court is temporarily under my supervision pending further inquiry. Judge Black, please step aside." There was a gasp. Judge Black's face turned a mottled red. She hesitated, clearly calculating whether to resist. But the presence of the marshals said enough. She stood slowly and stepped down from the bench. Montgomery took her seat. "Miss Bondi," he said, "you have evidence for the court's consideration?" Pam Bondi opened the folder. "Yes, Your Honor. Communications between Judge Jessica Black and senior executives at Brighton Development, including discussion of active motions, pretrial scheduling, and, most concerning, details of potential outcomes." She placed the folder on the bench. Behind her, a DOJ agent rolled in a cart with sealed digital evidence drives. The messages were recovered from Brighton's internal communications network. Additionally, we've confirmed offshore transfers to a Cayman Islands account linked to a trust controlled by Judge Black's family. Now it was Montgomery's face that darkened. He opened the envelope. The courtroom fell into absolute silence as he began flipping through printed emails. One mentioned favorable timing for dismissal. Another referred to Jessica B's understanding. It was damning. The judge looked up. "When did you obtain this?" 3 days ago. The FBI and DOJ's public integrity section were notified immediately." Defense attorneys looked panicked. One tried to speak, but Montgomery raised a hand. "This isn't about you anymore," he said sharply. "This is about the integrity of this bench." Pam Bondi remained composed, hands folded. The courtroom had transformed. The reporters who once mocked her were now wide-eyed, typing furiously. The law student sat motionless, watching justice turn on its axis. Montgomery stood. I am issuing an immediate suspension of Judge Black's judicial duties. I have seen enough to warrant further action." He turned to his clerk. "Contact the U.S. Marshal Service. Ensure Judge Black does not leave the building." The marshals by the door nodded and exited. Through the glass wall, Judge Black could be seen pacing in her chambers, frantically typing on her laptop. The FBI entered minutes later. A small team in blue jackets, public corruption unit, wheeled in digital forensics equipment. A Treasury official followed behind, holding a tablet with financial data. They entered Judge Black's chambers with authority. She shouted, demanded her lawyer, refused to hand over her phone. But within 30 minutes, the evidence was confirmed. 6 offshore wire transfers totaling $2.7 million, communication logs that aligned with case motions, a pattern of influence over reassigned cases involving Brighton and other affiliated corporations. One email read, "Ensure Brighton lands with JB. She understands what's at stake." Chief Judge Montgomery reconvened the courtroom. "This court will reconvene under emergency review. The evidence supports probable cause for arrest." The reporters who had come to watch Bondi stumble were now capturing history. Jessica Black was escorted into the courtroom. No robe, no confidence, just panic. The lead marshal addressed the court. "Your Honor, we are prepared to proceed." Judge Black opened her mouth, but no words came. She clutched her designer handbag like a shield. Bondi didn't gloat. She didn't even look directly at her. She simply stepped aside as the law moved forward. The arrest warrant was read aloud. Violations of Title 18, U.S. Code, bribery, money laundering, obstruction of justice. Jessica Black gasped. "You can't do this. This is my courtroom." Montgomery didn't even blink. "Not anymore." The handcuffs clicked into place. The same gallery that had cheered her barbs hours earlier now sat in stunned silence. Judge Jessica Black, once the terror of the courtroom, was now a defendant. Bondi returned to her seat, composed and silent. The fall was complete. The metal click of the handcuffs still echoed in the courtroom. Chief Judge Montgomery gavelled once more, restoring a hush that felt almost reverent. "Court is adjourned," he said simply. Reporters didn't move. Neither did the spectators. For a moment, the room simply breathed. Pam Bondi gathered her files without haste. Her team stood behind her, silent, steady. They had expected a long trial, possibly months. No one expected a judicial takedown before the first witness completed testimony. Outside, the courthouse steps were swarming with press. Microphones, cameras, panicked producers all wanted the same thing, a statement from the woman who just brought down a federal judge. But Bondi didn't stop. She walked past the cameras, head held high, giving them nothing but her silence and an expression that said everything. Inside, the FBI secured Judge Black's chambers. Digital evidence was being packed, laptops bagged, phones cloned. One agent whispered to another, "We just scratched the surface." The Brighton case would go on, but not under Judge Black. In the end, justice hadn't come from a gavel. It came from a woman everyone had written off before she even said a word. Final voiceover. Pam Bondi didn't need to shout. She didn't need theatrics. She had the facts, and she had the patience to let arrogance collapse on its own weight. The courtroom she walked into as an underdog became the place where she redefined power. And the judge who laughed first was the one who never saw the ending coming. Fade out.